In 2007, in anticipation of the Halo 3 beta, we all bought a game that would give us access to said beta. That game for many of us was a sleeper hit and was the original Crackdown. And 3 years later, in 2010, we got the sequel Crackdown 2, but what exactly changed over those years when it came to attention to detail? So if you don't know what Crackdown is essentially a chaos sandbox, beginning as basically a street cop and ultimately becoming a superhero with the objective of cleaning up the city. And Crackdown 2 is basically the same thing, but with a wild zombie freak apocalypse. But when it comes to the overall themes of these games, they couldn't be more different, whereas in the original Crackdown, it's basically an all-out war on crime. Freely traversing Pacific City, taking out all the gang lords in any way or order you see fit in an all-out gang war. While Crackdown 2 is about Pacific City's war against the freak virus, feeling more like a zombie apocalypse war at the end of the world versus the gang war that we saw in the previous Crackdown. But what I find so interesting is the differences in the gameplay between these two games. In the original Crackdown, as I said, it's an all-out war on crime, taking out the gang lords in any way you see fit. Whereas in Crackdown 2, the gameplay is actually determined by the time of day. During the day, you combat the terrorist cell human faction and survivors wandering around trying to figure out how they're going to survive the night. But when night comes, all hell breaks loose as the city breaks out into all-out war in an attempt to survive the freak apocalypse. Which is a big contrast from what we saw in Crackdown 1. And because of the wildly different themes, the two games are very different when it comes to enemy variety. With the original Crackdown focused on its war on crime, you mostly fight the 3 different gangs and their gang leaders. And while Crackdown 2 also has an enemy human faction with the terrorist cell group, this enemy faction has a bit more enemy variety around the freak apocalypse theme. With some units wearing full metal armor reminiscent of the Raider power armor from Fallout leaning into the apocalyptic theme. But the real enemy variety comes from the hordes of freaks themselves. By not just having hordes of basic zombie type freaks, but having different archetypes of freaks that are actually reminiscent of your agent's own abilities. Freaks that can match your agility so you can't just escape to the rooftops. Or even brute archetypes that can match your strength. But with the real fun being when all of these enemy types break out into an all-out war every time the sun goes down. And the tool you engage this chaotic sandbox with is none other than your personal agent that you build from the ground up with crazy abilities like super strength. And when it came to strength in the original Crackdown, you basically just had this roundhouse kick that you'd use against people and vehicles, sending them flying, and honestly, it was pretty hilarious. You could also pick up cars and throw them at the enemy, and even ground pound, which is also pretty cool. But Crackdown 2 takes strength in a different direction, whereas you don't really hit people quite as far, but you do have cool like punching combo animations, which is kind of nice. But the good changes come from the ability to actually use melee weapons like light poles, which is super awesome, and the ability to go into a ram state where you can just ram vehicles out of the way. Not to mention the ground pound, in my opinion, looks better, but I do miss kicking people across the world. That was awesome. But it wasn't just the strength that saw changes, as the agility saw some differences as well, as in the original Crackdown, agility was just the ability to run fast and jump high as a means of travel. While this is mostly the same in Crackdown 2 with some added features like running on water, but most notably the ability to use a wingsuit to glide, which is awesome. Not to mention my favorite skill, firearms, saw quite a few changes between the two games, whereas in the original Crackdown you had all kinds of different weapons, including handguns, which really leaned into the law enforcement feel. Also in the original Crackdown, whenever you used a sniper rifle, you could actually aim and zoom in with the scope. Not to mention when you switch between your primary and secondary weapon, they would just appear in your hand and you couldn't actually see your secondary weapon on your character. While Crackdown 2 does have a lot of weapon variety, they did cut all of the handguns from the game, which is a bit of a shame because I like the agency pistol in the original Crackdown with its ability to zoom. And speaking of zooming, you can't zoom in with any of the scopes in Crackdown 2, even if you're using a sniper rifle. But they did add a lot of new guns, like heavy weapons that you can use like miniguns. Not to mention when it comes to seeing weapons on your character, you can see both your primary and your secondary weapon on your agent, and switching between them looks much better than it did in the original Crackdown. There's also a noticeable dip in the quality of the actual explosions between the two games, whereas in the original Crackdown, whenever you say blew up a car, there would be an awesome cascading smoke effect that went up into the air after the explosions, and they look really great in that game. Whereas in Crackdown 2, I think they just wanted the explosions to have more fire, and I think it loses some of the uniqueness that we had with the explosions of Crackdown 1. And I have to mention the differences between the cars and the driving between these two games, because there was nothing like ripping out of the agency tunnel in a cruiser in the original Crackdown. But my favorite thing about the vehicles of the original Crackdown is that the agency vehicles, when you entered them, would actually transform, reflecting your driving skill in the game, adding new abilities and weapons to the vehicle. Whereas in Crackdown 2, these transforming agency vehicles were completely removed. I mean, you can still drive the agency supercar and the SUV, but they don't transform like they did in Crackdown 1. But it's kind of give and take because they did add flying vehicles like helicopters into Crackdown 2, and they're a blast to use. But probably the biggest cosmetic change between these two games is Pacific City itself, as in the original Crackdown, it's pretty much intact, it's just overwhelmed with a gang war. Whereas in Crackdown 2, the city is torn apart and mostly in ruins from the conflict with the Freak virus. And I gotta say, it's a lot of fun to go to the same location between the two games to see how they've changed, whereas in the original Crackdown, a location might look completely normal, whereas in Crackdown 2, it might be retrofitted into a slums for people trying to survive the Freak virus. Seeing what used to be normal city streets, except overwhelmed by crime, now made into makeshift defenses to protect the living is something I always found interesting. But at the end of the day, both Crackdown 1 and Crackdown 2 are awesome chaotic sandbox games where it feels like all kinds of crazy things can happen. It doesn't matter if you're playing Crackdown 1 and it's all-out war on crime, or Crackdown 2 and it's desperate war of survival against the Freak virus. Both these games are awesome and deserve your time if you haven't played them, and honestly, deserve more love from Microsoft. Well guys, you made it to the end. Thank you for watching this direct comparison of the original Crackdown versus Crackdown 2. Some of my favorite Microsoft exclusive games that no one really talks about, or at least not enough people talk about. I know there's a lot of fans of those original 2 Crackdown games, and Crackdown 3 just didn't really do it for us like those original 2 games did, and I feel like it's because of that Microsoft just it's kind of given up on the Crackdown franchise because Crackdown 3 was a bit of a flop, but I feel like there's enough fans of those first 2 Crackdown games that Microsoft needs to come back to Crackdown and show it some love, either through a remake of the original Crackdown or at least remastering and bundling together those first 2 Crackdown games and re-releasing them on modern consoles and Steam. I know there's a lot of fans of Crackdown that just want to be able to experience these games on PC, and they've never been able to do that. They've been locked away on 360 and Xbox Series X and X through backwards compatibility, but I know there's a ton of fans of this franchise that discovered it just like me, trying to play the Halo 3 beta and end up discovering Crackdown, an amazing game, just because we wanted to play that beta, and we end up getting gifted with an awesome game that we didn't even expect to be that great. And I feel like there's enough fans here, and they deserve to have these 2 games either, you know, remastered and bundled together, or just go back to the drawing board and remake Crackdown. Clean up the city by any means necessary, any way you want, with modern technology. I think that sounds fantastic, and honestly, Xbox needs more games that are hits, and Crackdown was one of those hits. A sleeper hit, but I feel like enough people like it, and the franchise deserves some love from Microsoft. But guys, that's all I have for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed making it for you guys, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to Live from My Basement, where I make cool new videos like the ones you're watching right now every single week, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future content, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. See you.